Those records ended up in a garbage can. But the garbage man never got them. During the middle of the night, someone came by and grabbed all those records. The Quakers have been looking for them for umpteen years. Never found them. Then one day, Roger Busher received a telephone call from somebody to come to some bookstore somewhere, and off he went. And when he got there, amongst the volumes that he found were the Quaker Minutes from 1828 to 1878.
Isn't that something?
Volume 1. I don't know where he went. I don't know who called him. And Roger said, "Do you have both of them?" The guy looked at him and he said, "Well, you want everything?" And he said, "No, I just found this one." He said, "Where did it come from?" He said, "Some man came in and he said he didn't need them. What was it worth?" And I told him I'd take it off his hands. He gave him a few dollars for it. The fellow was happy. And that was it. But what happened was Roger gave it to Ralph Birdsall. Ralph called New York. The lady from New York came up, and I had the opportunity to meet with her for an hour one afternoon. And then she told me about this Dell Upton's paper. But let's go back to the brick meeting house. I just want to talk about Millbrook, okay? And this is a paper that Louise found in her files. A map from Miss Catherine Waddell, one of the 4 in existence, bought by her father at an auction of historical material collected by the late Benson Lossing. Handwriting of the map is that of Henry Livingston. This is H. Livingston, Jr. of Locust Grove, who was a surveyor and served as a clerk of Dutchess County from 1737 to 1789. Evidently, the map was made between May 1750, February 1753. Shows division of the land into 36 lots of nearly an equal number of scores. The extent of the grant was an area of 12 by 16 miles, covered by 30,000 acres. The patent for the Great Nine Partners is dated May 27, 1697, extends from Hudson River to the Connecticut line, includes 9 water lots on the Hudson, so that each partner might have access to that way of transportation. The original boundary between the Dutch colony of New Netherlands and the English colony of Connecticut.
Thank you, I was freezing. Any more open there? Give me.
Sorry, okay. You okay? We got the heat on and the air conditioners on? Oh, okay.
Heat on, the windows open.
Okay.
Taxpayers' money. Yeah.
Well, anyway, the original boundary between the Dutch colony of New Netherlands and the English colony of Connecticut was to be 20 miles east of the Hudson River, not following the curves of the river, but being a straight line. This was not surveyed or marked, and the settlers from Connecticut moved to that part along the Sound, which had belonged to New York. Then in 1664, Charles granted to his brother James, Duke of York, the Dutch possessions in America. Thus, New Netherlands became an English colony. The boundary being in dispute, representatives from the colonies of New York and Connecticut met in 1725, and it was decided that Connecticut would have the land along the Sound, where Stamford and Greenwich are now located. In return, Connecticut would secede to New York, an equivalent area along the western border of Connecticut, running north to the Massachusetts line. This was known as the equivalent tract, but from its shape was called the oblong. Okay, on a map of Dutchess County, note a narrow strip projects into Columbia County. That shows the width of the oblong tract, which continues in a straight line south into Westchester County. It's about 1 mile and 5/8 wide. Quakers moved up into the oblong from all over the place, settling on Quaker Hill. They came from Connecticut, they came from Long Island, and I learned they even came over from Nantucket. They could get good title to the land. The remainder of the town of Pauling was part of the Beekman patent. Beekman's close relatives of Livingston and held their land under feudal tenure. Settlers there only tenants. The Quakers would not settle on land of this type. Dutchess County was formed in 1683. 1740, the Quakers came to the area from Long Island, Nantucket, Rhode Island, mostly English in origin. The names in 1740 sounds like Millbrook. Doty, Wing, Birdsall, Gifford. Then you get Coffins. Then you get Yeomans, which I haven't found around here. Havilands, which you know I haven't heard of them. And then Allens. And then they got a thing here. What's this? Oh, Whiteley and Irish. What's Whiteley and Irish?
There's
Louise?
an Irish family here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And Whiteley's, sure.
Oh, the Whiteleys and the Irish.
Yeah.
Oh, no, the
Sure,
Whiteleys,
yeah.
yeah, there are lots of Whiteleys around.
Yeah, the Irish too, there was a family right
Are
here.
they all Irishes? Okay.
Over on yeah,
Good.
over on Washington Avenue.
Okay, well, they were all names that we know.
Yeah, the Haverns, the one that built my house.
Good. Okay, I never ran across the name Yeomans before.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wasn't the real
Lydia.
down?
Okay,
Burbank.
fine.
Morris Mills of
Avenue
Burbank.
and Hearts.
Lydia
Yeah.
Yeoman, yeah.
Okay. Now, just digressing for a moment, I couldn't put this together, but in doing some reading for this was interesting. What they did, when the Quakers started up over in England, they were known as the Seekers. Now, the Seekers became very popular. Mystical groups at that time in England, everybody wanted to get in on one. So what happened, the Quakers, as they started to grow, some of the other groups got jealous. So what they did, they started a group called the Ranters and Ravers. All right? And just what they said, they were ranters and ravers. They were like holy rollers. They went into a meeting and started jumping up and down, shouting and all. And they came in and they joined the Quakers. So you had the one group who were the Seekers conducting a silent meeting, and all of a sudden, the holy roller ranters and ravers would jump up and start going through their machinations, rolling, hollering, the Holy Spirit had come upon them, and all of this. They found out that what happened was that this was all a setup. And so then they had to scrutinize very carefully as to who the new people were coming into the meeting to make sure that they could separate the ranters and the ravers from the seekers.
We had one in Clinton Corner.
Ranters and the ravers?
Yeah, but he was a lot of fun. Boy, we had that church packed, believe me. Aschenbach would be a German. Yeah, I think so.
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
Aschenbach.
Yeah. Oh, we thought he was a wonderful man.
He used to jump up at the meetings?
Well, yeah, he was quite lively, believe me.
Digressing one more time, I'll never forget, I used to hold revival meetings. Nobody will believe it around here. But when I was in North Carolina, revival meetings were very popular. And one time, I was invited to go way up into the mountains, where Virginia, northeast of Asheville, where Virginia and Carolina came together, and West Virginia all came together. And one day, this fellow said to me, "Preacher, you should come over to a real church after you get through with that group over there, those Presbyterians. They don't have any religion." So I said, "Oh, well, I'll think about it. I'll let you know." So after our meeting that night, I made mention to the preacher, and I said, "You know, I met this elder Johnson today, and he told me to come to his church." And the preacher looked at me and says, "How do you get along with rattlesnakes?" This was a snake church,
Oh, no.
where they take the snakes and they pass them around, and if the snake bites you and you die,
Boy,
that meant that you weren't a Christian.
that lets my wife out.
You weren't a Christian, if that's what their idea is. And there's a very excellent documentary film that every so often comes on about that snake church down there. They're all over that part of West Virginia.
Did you go?
No, ma'am, I don't get along. I see a snake, I go the other way. I don't even bother to ask if it's poisonous. But coming back now, the lands around in Dutchess County in the early 1700s were very wooded, and the interesting part is, around the year 1700, there were only 4 or 5 men living along the shoreline of Hudson River. In the year 1718, on one particular Sunday, I think it was like May the 18th, 2 churches of the Reformed Church were duly constituted on the same day. One in the morning and one in the afternoon. The preacher came down from Kingston and went into Poughkeepsie first, and started the church there, got on his horse and took off and went down Fishkill and started that church. And when I talked with the pastors, Rod Koopman and Herman Harmelink, about it, they always argue. They said, "You know, maybe he went to Fishkill first." Herman says, "No, we were close. He came to us first." Somewheres in the records, they did not record the exact time. They just put the date down. But it's very unusual fact that the same day, those 2 churches were constituted. But here we have, like in a period of 18 years, from 4 or 5 men living along the shore to where there are now enough to start 2 churches. Also, I learned that the records show that between 1700 and 1750, one of the reasons that not too many people went into the interior was that, well, according to Upton's report, Louise has here in hers, that there was a bounty for wolves. Okay, they'd go after the wolves, but there was an animal in this area that even in Africa today is considered, God bless you, one of the most fierce of all animals, and that's the black panther. There were panthers roaming Dutchess County in the early 1700s, and probably mountain lion, because even right now, I know of a writer, if someone can tell me, is that Riga Lake north of Salisbury? When you go into Salisbury by the town hall, you turn to the left, and there's a keeper there, and you've got to go through a chain with permission to go up to the top, and there's a lake up there.
I think I've seen.
And this writer lives up on top of that lake, and he used to keep German shepherds, Doberman pinchers, and he'd let them out at night, and these dogs didn't come back. He'd find their bodies. So what he did, he found a friend of his that was raising the Rhodesian Ridgeback. This is a dog that was developed to fight the equivalent of the Mau Mau in Rhodesia in the early days before the separation. I'm not sorry, not the separation, but before independence. These dogs were raised and bred to, even before that, on the plantations. The dog weighs between 160 and 190 pounds and stands very tall. It's one of the larger dogs around, not as large as what they call the Great Pyrenees, which I understand will go and fight even tigers. But this dog will go 160 to 180. After he put his Ridgeback out, he came back each morning. Whatever it was out there, didn't disturb him too much. But this is what they had. This was a pretty wild place in the early 1700s.
Now, when was it that this Ridgeback?
No, this is over in he brought this in just recently, within the last 10 years, because Bob Wanstall, who was the chaplain over at Wassaic, knew this fellow. And Bob died about 5 years ago. And he was telling me about him. And he had his Ridgeback up there. But
They can also run very fast.
oh yes, they can really fly. And they are not afraid of anything. They're so loyal to their master that I think if a hippo came, that they would go after it. They don't know what fear is. And with children, they're like a boxer. A youngster can pull their ears and jump all over them and pound on them, and the dog will not do a thing. But if anyone comes near that dog, they just react like a Doberman. You better be very careful. They love kids. Okay. The interior of Dutchess County was not explored. We had people coming in from Connecticut, from the east. So Dutchess County, you go up and down the river and go up and down the oblong, and you find people. But in between, it was like, the Wild West, I guess. So Hudson River, east and north, Rhinebeck to Pleasant Valley, Washington Hollow, if you wanted to come. Because these were the trails that were marked out. Rhinebeck down to Pleasant Valley, Washington Hollow, then over through Washington, which is Mechanic and South Millbrook, to Dover to New England. Then in 1760, Samuel Mabbitt opened his store on the land east of what is now the Meeting House. The earliest meetings were held in homes. In 1742, the Quakers started to grow. It was called the Nine Partners Meeting because of the land area. It came out of the oblong, which was set off from Purchase in 1744. Nine Partners was a preparatory meeting. This was the first stage before they could become a monthly meeting. They had to be a preparatory meeting, and as a preparatory meeting, I guess the equivalent would be, Wendell, would be like a mission church, right? Because they were receiving some help.
But perhaps, yeah.
I think that would be about as close as we could get to it. Would be like a mission church. And then once they became self-supporting, they went on their own. It became a monthly meeting in 1769, being set off from Oblong. In March of 1745, Aaron Haight conveyed to Isaac Thorne and William Palmer, and then they conveyed the 6 acres of land to the Committee of Friends, stipulating that it be held by them and their successors for religious and burial purposes forever. In the 1740s, a meeting house of logs was built. That burned down on December 27th of 1778, and the new brick building was built. Okay? The new brick building was built, and if you can fathom this, okay? It was built to seat 1,000 people.
Wow.
This is the present building. Now, this is the present, when you look at it, you'd say 1,000 people in it. If you look at the configuration of the pews and the way those pews, because in that meeting house, remember, in a traditional church, you just have your pews here and you have your altar up front. In a Quaker meeting house, you just build, you have seats all around.
Then
And you-
gallery too.
Right, you have galleries, and then also you have it on the other side. There was a wedding that was held there about 3 years ago, and the reception was going to be at Altamont, and they wanted to invite 500 people. And when someone said to me, "What church in Millbrook will seat 500 people?" I said, "The Quaker Meeting House." But I don't know if they will let you put 500 people in there, because I'm not sure that the board will allow that many people to go up into the balcony. But you could probably seat comfortably 300 to 400 downstairs with the pews that are there presently. But what they used to do, they had a way that they would put the pews in a configuration, and they used to hold a lot of their annual meetings there. This is when the Quakers come together from all over the state, okay? Or when the monthly meeting would entertain other meetings at large assemblies. So they had a large crew of people that they could get in there. One of the interesting things was, as I was telling George before the meeting, Quakers were like everybody else when it came to figuring. They figured they'd build this new cathedral of theirs, it's not a cathedral, but their new church, or meeting house, I should say, for 600 pounds. And they went out and they raised 358 of them. Well, then they started to build and ended up costing almost twice as much. So they needed a fundraiser. And where did they go for a fundraiser? They went down to Long Island and got the potato farmer, whose name was Elias Hicks. This is 40 years before the Hicksites came on the scene. He was a potato farmer and a fundraiser on the side. Hicks came in, he cajoled, he hustled, he grabbed, he preached, he sat on, I guess he did every technique in the book. But anyway, in 4 years, he got the money. Okay? But he went around and they got the money, and then they said, "Thank you, Mr. Hicks," and paid him whatever his fee was, and he went on his way, and I guess he came back to Quaker events, but he didn't come back till later on when he started the Hicksite movement in 1828. Now, Quakers were very large. This meeting, Oblong started first, then Oswego, and even Clinton is older than Nine Partners. And one other one, I think it's Pleasant Valley, is a little bit older. But as these meetings started in that late 18th century and the early part of the 19th, 14 Quaker meetings developed in Dutchess County, in places that we even forget about. Mountain View Road off of the Taconic, it was a Quaker meeting house. One in Dover, one north of Dover in what they call the Northeast, Crum Elbow, over toward Rhinebeck, Stanfordville, up toward Pine Plains, and then several all over the south. There were 14 altogether. And everything was fine until Mr. Hicks came along. Then Mr. Hicks came in and said to the people, "You can remain traditional, or you can become enlightened and follow me." And with that, Mr. Hicks divided every Quaker meeting house in Dutchess County. That was the beginning of that was the end of the highlight, of the heyday of Quakers. Now, going back into England, the Quakers were very evangelistic. They used to go out and hold street meetings, knocked on doors to come to church, and did this while they were here. That's where they got into trouble with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, because of their evangelistic fervor. And what happened was, whenever they stayed any place too long, they had to get out of town, because they were persecuted. In the Bay Colony, Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, many Quakers were hung because of their beliefs. What happened was they were told to stop, and they wouldn't. They were told they would be punished. They were given warning. It was not a case of go out, round them up like Paul used to do when he was Saul with the Christians and throw them to the lions. They were warned. They were told not to. They were given every chance not to. They were given every chance to move away, and they would go to other colonies. Long Island became a place from Westbury, 1643. Was a meeting down there, and that was just one of the strongest ones. And from there, they started moving all around, going into other areas. Quakers had a hard time under Peter Minuet and Peter Stuyvesant in New York. The Dutch, for some reason, did not like the Quakers and persecuted them. The English were a little more tolerant. The Dutch were rough. There were no warnings with the Dutch. They just had a roundup. I guess what you would say, from some of the sources that I've read, being a Quaker in Dutch New York would have been like, what? Living in Russia? When the communists started knocking on doors under Stalin?
Why were they considered objectionable?
Because of their beliefs, because they were different. See, the Quakers do not believe in sacraments. No baptism. Quakers do not have a statement of faith. I was talking with a good Quaker friend of mine, and most of you know Allison Ben Wagner. And I said, Allison, the Federated Church is trying to put together, we're trying to see which creed we can, we were going to come up with a statement of faith of our own for the church. And he says, you have to ask each Quaker what they believe in, what they think. You have freedom of expression in the church. And the Dutch Reformed Church, you have to remember, came out of a Calvinistic background. And in Switzerland, you thought like John Calvin did, or else. It was a theocracy when he was there. And the Quakers wanted freedom. Well,
They were very good living people.
Oh, yes.
They must have had a good
Yeah.
moral background.
also going back, Revolutionary War, when they asked the Quakers to serve in the army, they said no. They would not bear arms. Don't tell Ralph this, but Mr. Birdsall was quite a character, Nathaniel. I read what he did. He was always in trouble with houses. He'd find a piece of property and he'd take a liking to it, and then he'd buy it. But the whole problem was something to do with title and deeds. So what he would do, he'd go in, and whoever was in the house, he'd throw him out. So then they'd go to the church, and the church would throw him out, and then they'd work it out, and he'd recant, and then he'd come back, and he'd be in good order again until the next time. But he was always in the houses, something to do in the houses. Then there was another time, he and his son, they found a man drowning. And they tried to save him, and they did. They rescued him, but he didn't survive. He's been in the water too long. Well, this fella had a slave, and he said, my dying wish is I'm going to give this slave his freedom. Well, what they did, they said, well, he gave you your freedom, but we're saying you're a slave, so they took him out and sold him. And so when the Quakers heard about this, the new owner, he came and he says, this slave says he's a freedman, and I came to the Quakers to tell you that, you're Mr. Birdsall and his son, they sold him to me. Now we've got to get this matter adjudicated here. Well, it seems that it was the son's idea, so Nathaniel got out of that one too. But he was always being hauled into church to see if they were going to let him stay in the meeting or not. But most of the time it was property dealings. When you go back and you read these records, it's funny. You know, as time went on, when they had the split, no, wait a minute, let me go back. Okay. When the traffic prospered here, conditions improved. In about 1793, the Friends subscribed to a fund to build the boarding school. 1794, the Friends of 9 partners submitted the proposal to the New York Neely meeting for its establishment. And the men appointed to carry out this proposition were Joseph Talcott, Isaac Thorne, Paul Upton, Trip Mosier, Peter Lossing. And the school received pupils in 1796, stayed until 1863, then they moved to Union Springs, New York, and then in 1920 back to Oakwood School. And then when Mr. Hicks came along, they divided up. They sold the property was divided. The Orthodox received the title to the 9 partners school and the Hicksites to the meeting house. And then the Orthodox built their meeting house just to the east of the brick meeting house. And then in 1882, they moved to Friendly Lane, which is now the library parking lot. That was sold to the Knights of Columbus, who in turn sold it to the library. It's now a parking lot. Now, as you know, the Federated Church, the Quakers came in 1926, along with the Methodists and the Reformed. Now, the Hicksites, they didn't do too well, and in 1897, they conveyed all of their property over to the trustees of the 9 Partners Cemetery. Meeting house is 40 by 50, 20 feet high, 2-foot thick walls. Everything in that building was made locally. Wood from nearby forest. The windows, the frames and sashes are cypress, set with ham-bone glass. It lasted 175 years. The floors were yellow pine, fastened with hand-wrought nails. The door hinges as well were divided after Quaker fashion, and the building is into male and female section, each with its own iron box stoves. Stoves, I understand, were made locally. Jacob Willits was responsible for that. The pews and the unpainted columns have not been touched since it was built. And we have, as you know, outside there used to be horse blocks, but they're not there now. And well, as we go on and we look at it, the Quakers flourished here, and they came from all over. And the one thing that you can be proud of as people of Dutchess County, in many areas religious freedom in this country was not freedom as we know it. But the Quakers here could meet, and they weren't bothered.
Could I say a word about that Quaker boarding school that
Yeah.
started in 1796?
Mm-hmm.
It was the first boarding school for boys and girls ever to be made in the whole United States. And I think we're very proud of that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Willits wrote an arithmetic that was used as a foundation for other schools in the country. I think his name was Willits, that was the head of it.
I know there was a Jacob, reading about a Jacob Willits.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, Jacob Willits was the teacher.
Yeah, he was the principal.
Right.
That's it, yeah. Same
This
one.
one,
Because they would have counted that in the county of Dutchess.
there's one thing, there's one map here I wanted to show you. This is quite a document. It's, I don't know why it was never published. But remember I told you, okay, I'm not sure, well, you probably, I think I'll pass it around. But this is this shows where all the Quaker meeting houses were. And they're all over. Quaker Meeting House in Clinton. It's now the Grange Hall. There's one in Pleasant Valley. down by, I think it's down by Wappingers Creek. I'm not sure what meets there now. And then you know the one in Crum Elbow. What's there now,
The Pleasant
Charlie?
Valley